Hello, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of City Talk. It's the Tuesday after what was to be the May 24th weekend, or the Victoria Day weekend. Kind of odd to have May 24th on May 18, but there we are. We did, and we're back at it, trying to wake ourselves up and get back at what is happening to cities in time of COVID. I'm the president of the Canadian Urban Institute. We're in the connective tissue business, and we, since COVID, have been responding to the need for information and sharing and understanding what's actually happening around us with three platforms: citywatchcanada.ca, citysharecanada.ca, and this one we're on today, citytalkcanada.ca, where we invite people like these brave four to talk to us about a particular aspect of urban life and what they're observing, what they see is really happening, what they think is likely to happen, and what do they think needs to happen. So today it's all about Main Streets, and in fact CUI is leading an effort across the country, across Canada, called Bring Back Main Street. You can go find it at bringbackmainstreet.ca. And in fact, what we're keen on is to hear stories about how your main streets are coping and what do you see ahead in your neighborhood. So one way that listeners could help us is if you would send us some photos of what you're seeing on your main streets. And you can send those on Twitter. You can email them to covidresponse@canurb.org, covidresponse@canurb.org, or you can put them on Twitter with the hashtag BringBackMainStreet, and then tag us at CanUrb so that we can see what's going on your main streets. And we recognize that main streets take different forms. They may be a traditional block, but they may also be a four corners, or they may be a strip mall, or it's the place where you go and where others go to meet one another, have some kind of exchange, have some kind of communal experience, and what you would sort of call as the heart of your community. Where is the main street that you gravitate to, and what's it going to take for these places to come back? These broadcasts initiate where I am anyway, in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas with Credit, the Anishinaabe and the Chippewa and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas with Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are very aware that the Indigenous communities across the country are having their own particular experience and struggle with COVID, and particularly urban Indigenous. And so we're interested in that. How is the urban Indigenous community responding, and particularly urban Indigenous businesses, many of which are on main streets? One near me, a couple blocks over, Bannock House, is an Indigenous business. So we want that to be part of our inquiry as well. The conversations always begin here, but they never end. They're an endless conversation. So please continue on Twitter with hashtag CityTalk. We will record this session as we are now, and we will post it with a summary. And the other thing is, as anyone who's been on a City Talk knows, we have a very active chat community. There's a lot of life in the chat. So please, group, chat away. Use the setting on the bottom of your screen that says to all panelists and everyone, because what happens is chatters end up answering each other's questions much more quickly than sometimes the panel can get to them. And the other thing is that, as we've said, anything that goes on that chat is on that chat. It stays there. So just keep that in mind. The world will see it because we'll post it afterwards. And we appreciate that we have some really robust conversations, and we learn a ton from these things, not just from the folks that come on us like these folks, but also the people like you who are listening in and asking questions and really making clear what your experience is. I think if there's anything we want to derive from the COVID experience, it's that we all have our experiences of our communities, and we need to give voice to those and learn from each other and create the kind of peer-to-peer opportunities in Canada with city builders across the country. So please tell us what you're seeing on your main streets. We have 3 sessions this week. This one on Thursday, where we're going to hear from voices from abroad, and then on Friday, when we will be with yet another esteemed mayor of a Canadian city. The other thing we always want to acknowledge is that we recognize that cities are still in tight, dire straits. Municipal governments are still struggling with how they're going to pay their bills. They're facing extraordinary expectations being placed on them, both fiscally and just in terms of manpower. Municipal governments are having to lay staff off. We are very cognizant of this, that we are having these conversations, but it's a luxury because lots and lots of Canadians around the country and in Michael's world, in the US, engaged in frontline service work, keeping people alive, keeping people safe. So we always want to be acknowledging of that. This conversation is no substitute or intended to in any way distract us from the matters at hand, which is keeping people alive and safe. Okay, so bring back Main Street. Let's hear from our four gang here. I was going to call you a gang of thieves, but that's not right. You're not thieves. You're probably the opposite of thieves. You're believers. You're people that have been invested for some time in why the local economy matters and what the role of a Main Street is in actually creating vibrant urban life. And we have people coming from quite different perspectives with us today. So we post their bios online, so I don't do much of an introduction other than their names and their cities. So the first person I'm going to ask to just fill us in on what he's seeing from his perch is our friend Michael Shuman with, I see, a Canadian prop behind him, Michael Shuman from Washington, D.C. So talk to us, Michael, about what you're seeing in terms of Main Street impacts and what's your sense?
Yeah, so obviously the impact is severe. And one of the impacts is that federal support, even after 3 stimulus bills, is way too little to help Main Streets and way too little for state and local governments here in the United States. And what I'm seeing is that many of these municipalities and states are looking at ideas that as recently as 3 months ago were regarded as far-fetched, and now they're making them front and center because these ideas can basically provide stimulus at zero cost, or actually they may even make money. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. People are thinking much more seriously about local investment, which would bring money into local businesses. The state of Michigan, for example, has just introduced a bill to give a 50% tax credit to people who invest in local businesses. People are thinking more about public banking to put excess revenues to work in local banks and credit unions. People are talking about changes in procurement policy that would favor more local businesses and actually lead to cheaper tenders. And people are talking about local purchasing programs initiated by the grassroots that involve things like adopting a business and bringing that business alive through consumer support.
I was going to ask you, what's the difference between local purchasing and local procurement? So local procurement is public sector buying?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And the local purchasing is behavior by individuals or businesses.
Right, right. Okay, well, I'm going to change the order that I was initially planning. Jake, I want to go to you next because you actually work in the financial sector. Jake is from Toronto and she's with VanCity and the VanCity Community Investment Bank. So Michael just gave you a perfect pitch there about local banks, public banks. So tell us what the perspective is from VanCity's perspective.
Thank you, Michael, for pitching it right down the middle. I even wrote that down. I appreciate it. So to build on what Michael said, and first thing, Mary, thanks for the invitation. This is a really important conversation. And I think what, on top of everything Michael mentioned, we're observing is speed. The process of mobilize, strategize, stabilize has sped up in ways that I don't think I would have anticipated as a financial services professional. And so saying that, one of the things we realized very quickly in our organization was we wanted to lead. So we wanted to get products out there very quickly that would address the issues that Michael mentioned, which how do you get capital to those organizations and individuals quickly who absolutely needed it? We knew our government here in Canada would come to the table, but we really wanted to be out in front of that a little bit to ensure that, to Michael's point, our constituents, members and customers knew we were there and ready. And so from a leadership perspective, We looked at, who's going to need what quickly. What is relief, i.e. families potentially needing reductions on interest rates on credit cards was one of our early discussions. We went to 0 very quickly. We also went to market in both organizations with a unity deposit, and then for retail members, individuals, and then came behind that with one for organizations, because we knew it wasn't just going to be individuals who wanted to invest in helping the local grassroots organizations that Michael spoke about being so important. So we wanted to make sure that we bookended that for individuals and businesses. And then our next step in that was really, okay, so if we raise this capital, how do we deploy the capital in a way that's meaningful? So we've got a pivot loan, a unity loan, which is, 2 different products serving 2 different types of needs. One for organizations that need to pivot and have pivoted. For example, Mary, you'll be familiar with this. In Toronto, you're seeing a lot of these distilleries pivoted very quickly and very early to build, to make hand sanitizer. So we looked at what are organizations and individuals going to need, and we went very quickly ourselves through the mobilize, strategize, and stabilize. And the other thing I would add to build on what Michael said is we started with our people. We looked at the people within our organizations and how do we mobilize quickly. So even ourselves as financial institutions, some of those things that we would take 3 to 6 months to stand up, we said we've got 3 to 6 days. And so we challenged ourselves as well and rose to the occasion, working in parallel. And Mary, you're familiar with our communications teams in our organizations. They were very quick to start working with the federal government to ensure, the programs they were going to come out with would dovetail nicely with what we were doing, and ensuring that we would make that type of capital available at that local grassroots level in the small, medium enterprises we serve.
I want to come back to both Michael and Jake specifically on money and how, because I think there's lots of anxiety that all the relief, and we are 2 different countries, but there are patterns that one can see that all the relief is going to be scooped up by bigger business. So I want to come back to Jake and Michael on that in a second. I'm going to now go over to Judith and Regina, but before I go to you, can I just encourage everybody on the chat, please change your little toggle switch, folks, to all panelists and attendees. As much as the panelists love to hear from you, the dilemma is that the rest of the world doesn't see it. So we really want you to go, and if you've already sent a comment to just the panelists, can you go back in and send it to everybody so we can all see it? The other thing is I'm appreciating people are checking in from their main streets, and that is tremendous. So if you could, again, check in and send to all panelists and attendees, what's your main street? Where are you writing in from? I'm seeing Roncy, I'm seeing Halifax, I'm seeing various places. I'm seeing an interesting initiative in Calgary from the culinary, Calgary's culinary and cultural capital, thank you. So again, plug for us, if you are working on a main street or there is a main street association which you have some contact good, that's costing lots of people to come and tell us, which street are you championing for? We want to hear you. Okay, Judith, Regina, and also other links. I think there was some downtown borough, some new Peterborough site. As I said, these chats are really rich, so fill us in, folks. We want to hear where you're coming from. Judith, talk to us, Regina.
Thanks, Mary, and it's great to see all the people in the chat. I know a lot of you are my colleagues that I've seen at various conferences, so again, it's nice to connect even though it's through virtual. BIDs, BIAs, we are the ones that are closest to our main streets. We're that layer in between city and the business themselves. And when you're in a business dealing with a crisis, sometimes you are not, well, all the time, you're not paying attention to what's going around you. You're worried about staying afloat. You're worried about keeping open the doors. So that's where the BIDs have really come in to be that layer to communicate what the greater good is for the downtown or your main street to decision makers at the municipal level, the provincial level, and the federal level. And what I've seen here is that our role which really focused in Regina anyways on placemaking, has really shifted to advocacy. We've done a lot of work on advocacy. We've done a lot of work on research, because again, we deal with a lot of businesses that English might not be their first language. They're kind of floating in this gray area where they're not sure where to access information. They're not sure what information is important. So we've been doing a lot of sifting through a lot of the noise and boiling it down to what's important, what programs are out there, what do you qualify for. We educate. That's just it. We educate not just the businesses, but our municipal leaders. This is why this is important. This is what we're seeing on the ground level, and this is what you can do to help. And in reality, we are therapists. You know, we're on calls with some of these folks that are at risk of losing everything, and we do our best to calm them down, to point them in the right direction and be there for them. So there's just been a lot of roles we've had to pivot into that we might not have been there before. I've had conversation with, I've been here for 10 years, and I've had conversations this past 8 weeks with folks that I've never had a chance to speak to, but they've reached out because they see the value in what we do for them. And I feel here in Regina, especially as a capital city and being so close to the legislature here, we've been able to affect that change for them and provide them with grant funding and provide their situation to the decision makers so they can craft programs that would help the guys on the ground. Today, day after Victoria Day, is the first day of our retail sector and personal services sector opening. So we're pretty excited about seeing what that will look like. I know there's a lot of tempered excitement from the community. You know, retail can open, and I think that's what we've all been waiting for, but will the customers come back? Do they feel safe? Are we doing enough to make them feel safe? So we've done a lot of work here in our bid to increase that training for the bid, increase that capacity for our businesses, and just convey that sense of safety. And again, just share how you can interact with Main Street at your comfort level, whether it's online, in person, but a little bit further apart. We're just here to make sure that the community knows that Main Street is open for business and that you need to continue to support them in whatever way possible to make sure that they're still here at the end of this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Judith. And of course, you're also the chair of the International Development Association, right? So you have a purview across the country. There's a lot of commonality and challenges that are being felt at different scales by different communities, obviously. And Michael, for your benefit, I don't know if you're familiar with the nomenclature we're using: Canada Business Improvement Areas, Business Improvement Districts, and in some cases we have Business Improvement Zones, but you know the gist of it, I suspect. Charles, we're getting lots of questions in the chat, which I bet you're going to start to address, which is this notion of how we use the Main Street as a place and the various engagers in that place. So talk to us a little bit, if you could, about Happy City and your perspective, speaking to us from the Cowichan Valley in British Columbia.
Yes, I'm in my mother's basement here. If you could see behind this screen, you would see children's beds. I want to set some context and then talk specifically and maybe create a menu for you of different initiatives that are happening around the world. But the context, I think, is really important. This needs to be seen through the perspective of, yes, of economy, but also public health and well-being. Just yesterday, I was at the local power center, where you can imagine what that looks like. Giant big boxes. We drive from parking lot to parking lot. Early analysis is showing those kinds of environments are associated with viral spread in the state of New York and around New York City, and that connected, walkable, contained neighborhoods are actually the kinds of places that are more associated with less viral spread. Looking more broadly at a picture of public health, we know the walkable neighborhood, that Main Street itself performs a social function, but also a health function. We know people are living longer through disasters and crises when they have those walkable, fine-grained connected places. So what's happening in the world now? Well, unfortunately, the pandemic is just the gasoline that's been poured on the fire of Main Street troubles. And so what's exciting to see is, despite this difficult time, cities across Canada and the world, in fact, are using space differently and getting more flexible. So first of all, yes, we need to change the way we use streets and public space, and it's happening from Paris to Milan to Auckland, even to Vancouver, where we're giving more space over to people who are walking and biking. By the way, if you bought bike stocks a month ago, you'd be rich now, because it's getting hard to buy a bike in North America. They're flying off the shelves. Businesses need more space. It's important to take a public health and an equity perspective on this. For example, the city of Vancouver giving more space to restaurants to float onto the street. Well, what about people who use the street all the time and can't afford a restaurant? So the new rule will be that if you can't afford to eat there, you still get to sit there. But I think I'm not going to layer all this on right now, because I just want to touch on one point and open up the discussion. But we also need to think about how we're using our land differently. I think the biggest crisis of Main Street, there aren't enough people living close to our main streets to shop at these places, to walk there and shop there. So how can we use land differently, both above those spaces, and how can we rezone spaces so that more people can live closer to Main Street? And that also is happening around the continent, not yet sparked by the pandemic, but I hope this ramps it up. Think of Portland, which has legalized fourplexes across the city. I'll stop there for now.
I mean, thanks, Charles, and thanks, everybody. I mean, this is a whole bunch of situations, isn't it? It's not just one thing. That's probably why we're so interested in tackling Main Street at CUI, because it's sort of a proxy for a whole bunch of challenges. Where is the affordable housing? How does capital get dispersed? How do people get around? How do you navigate that shared public realm? And what are the rules that are in place to do that? So I feel like we've got two areas. One is about money and capital and how that's all going to flow. And then there's this bit about space and how we allocate space. And obviously they're really linked together. Judith, I'm wondering if I could come back to you for a second. In terms of the kinds of counsel that BIDs can provide to their members, and BIDs and BIAs have vendors as members, but you also have landlords, right?
Absolutely. We have to represent both, and that's why the rent issue is very touchy for us, because we don't want to pick winners or losers. But getting back to what Charles is saying, I love the idea of tactical urbanism. We've run workshops here in Regina to educate our businesses, but I do see even more education that needs to happen. I'm in Regina. We are the land of pickup trucks here. Everyone drives, no one takes the bus.
Right.
So I guess getting into the mindset of a business owner that for the last 20 years has wanted that parking spot in front of his building to be free for his customers, just getting them to understand that right now, you probably need that space to generate revenue for you, not necessarily for the city. So Judith, there's a lot of.
But what about the challenge of delivery? I mean, I know what you're suggesting, and you're right that there are sadly all sorts of examples of business owners who want that parking spot for themselves. But what about if they want to actually have the commercial delivery system? You know, if we've had all sorts of pushback here in Toronto, for instance, where they did a pilot on a street that did minimize cars, and the businesses would argue that it made it very difficult for them to get inventory and all that kind of stuff. What do you say to that in terms of making this?
I think that's where those conversations need to happen. So is it pushing out into the parking lane to create that patio space, but perhaps taking over a travel lane to accommodate those deliveries? It depends on what your cross section is, obviously. And then it's conversing and finding what the commonalities are within your block. What do your neighbors need? What do you need? And how do we manage that curbside? And then how do we convey that need to city city halls, city council, so they can make those policy decisions to allow you to do it, even if it is just for a pilot.
And maybe, I mean, we've been saying on City Talk here that COVID has put the whole world on a pilot. We're one big honking pilot right this minute. And as Michael said, you know, things that were not even seen as possible all of a sudden have been made to be possible. What about this idea that Michael was proposing about adopting a restaurant? Michael, you're trying to reinforce the idea that I would have a personal relationship and an obligation, I think, to a business in my neighborhood. Yes?
Yes, so I have a great favorite restaurant, bar, bookstore in the Washington area called Busboys and Poets. And I want to make sure that that restaurateur survives. So I approached him 2 weeks ago and I said, Andy Shalal is the proprietor. And I said, Andy, I want to do the best I can to get cash in your hand now. Can I buy $1,000 of meals from you right now? And Andy said, not only that, but we're so grateful, but we're going to give you 20% more. So I'm getting a 20% return on my investment from pre-purchasing meals with Andy. And I feel like all of us really should think about what is the one great local business that we love and how can we get some cash in its hands? That's a simple thing. But I also want to emphasize that where you invest your money is really important. And I am betting here that if we did a survey of the 300 plus people on this call, we would find that 99% of your investment was going into global corporations, not into Main Street. So all of you have an obligation to systematically start moving your savings, your RRSPs, into local businesses in Main Street.
Jake, Michael keeps passing perfectly to you. He keeps throwing you balls. Okay. I think, you know, just for people's benefit, and, you know, VanCity is the second largest credit union, I think, in the country. Am I right, Jake? Next to Desjardins, probably?
Largest.
And,
yeah, largest. Yeah.
Okay.
In British Columbia.
Certainly in British Columbia, but across the country, there are Desjardins, the big one in Quebec.
Yes.
And this idea that, are there ways to keep your money more locally invested? And Michael, you had suggested a bunch of ways. The idea of public banking, the idea of local procurement. Jake, do you have further thoughts on this about how you as VanCity as an industry leader can kind of move to get more of this money to actually be invested locally?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I had sent to the group over the weekend was product design and construct. So there's an intentionality, Mary, that needs to happen. And I think, you know, organizationally, that was one of the reasons we started the way that we did. For example, you know, going out with the Unity Fund, the term deposit that VanCity went out with was really intentional, because the intent was to raise the capital and deploy the capital to organizations who were doing one of two things, as I said, pivot or need help. And so intentional banking, where I'm fortunate, you know, to be working for the organization I work with, this is what we do. So we're a purpose-built organization.
But how do we get more of you? Or how do we get your norms to be more mainstream norms in the financial services industry?
It is a conversation we often have, Mary, and I think it's pushing that boulder up the hill. And it links to what Judith and Charles and Michael have all said, which is, you know, is COVID the crisis that gives us the opportunity to do what was impossible? And so, but the challenge we're going to have is there's going to be conflicting desires. So there's going to be people who ride bikes that don't want that part, like that don't want that change. So I think the solution as it relates to Main Street is, for each group of stakeholders, what does Main Street mean? And getting an understanding of what that looks like for them so that you can speak to where they are. Because if we're having conversations about, so for example, I grew up in Stratford, Ontario. And so a festival city, huge tourism, massive economic benefit from small business. What's different about this crisis than the financial crisis was businesses did not shut their doors on a certain day in 2008.
Right.
Here we did. And so as a financier, sometimes I can't even think about that because I think cash flow stopped. So in order to have the right conversation about Main Street, we need to understand the impact of that stalling of cash flow, because it's different. Judith will relate to this. It's different for every type of organization. And a lot of us represent both sides. So we deal with landlords, plus we finance businesses, or we work with businesses. Those are conflicting conversations. So when we looked at it holistically as an organization, we realized that we had to mobilize in the community, i.e. community level. So we assisted in building, or you'll be familiar with this, the Better Toronto Coalition. So we funded directly into foundations that we knew had the systems to deploy money quickly to those Main Street businesses who potentially would need it. We knew as a financial institution, deployment of it, we could not do it as quickly. So we mobilized our capital and partnered with people that are experts at getting it into the community in different buckets, whether it was food safety, safety, health and wellness, or actual cash that needed to go into business. And then we looked at working with our current constituents. Who were the constituents that had populations of people that fill Main Street with either people, human resources, ideas, or product? So for example, we worked and formed a rent relief fund with one of the organizations here in Toronto, CSI Mary, so that their group, their constituents they served would not be left hanging out in the wind to not have that support. So there were two ways we looked at it: community mobilization, and how do we work with our members, and how do we work with our customers in two different ways to raise that capital and deploy it where it needs to be. But I think Michael said something really important, and this is the piece, and Judith touched on it, and Charles touched on it, and so did you, Mary: procurement. So if we're going to do what Charles talked about as it relates to land, and we're going to use our land differently, and we're going to use our real estate differently, then the procurement process in our municipalities absolutely needs to change. Because if we're going to look at affordability from the perspective of a percentage of, if we can't map that to in perpetuity, affordability in perpetuity, whether it's for a business or someone where they live, then all of this benefit we're potentially getting from this COVID crisis will not come to be, because affordability is the real bullet.
Yeah, I mean, there is something we're going to call the COVID dividend. Maybe we're going to come out of this doing some of the right things. Charles, you mentioned that it's a package, right? It's Main Street. Is there a local community that can live around the Main Street to support it, right? And I was in Scarborough over the weekend looking at some of the strip malls there, and I think we need to acknowledge, as I suggested, Main Street's not the same across the country. Some places you cannot walk there. And I want to just caution urbanists that we tend to be very snobby about this. And if somebody has to get there in their pickup truck like Regina, as Judith suggested, that we tend to judge them. Well, let's just be clear, that's sometimes the only option they've got. But when I was in Scarborough, I was interested. You have to drive in Scarborough. I don't know if anybody's been there, but you have to drive. And I was really interested, though, that I could see that the people that were shopping in the strip malls that were really vibrant looked to me as if they did live within the blocks that surrounded that area. So it seems the real estate piece, the affordability piece, seems to be something that some communities have been able to address. Charles, what's your perspective on that? You work around the world. What do you think?
Well, I think North America is a remarkable place for how we've locked ourselves into patterns that deny us freedom and flexibility when it comes to use of space, use of retail space, and use of residential space. I'm noticing some of the comments on the side there. Gil Peñalosa, hi Gil, noted that, you know, we're completely locked in, even close to retail zones, to the detached house model. And that needs to change. People are hurting now. They need to be able to do more with the land they live on. We need to allow more unrelated people living in the same house. In Vancouver, that was banned until recently. And you do note that, yeah, many people who are shopping at in strip mall environments got there in other ways than a vehicle. I want to note several initiatives that have been happening around the world, not all of them recently. Mountain View, California. You know, we talk about retailers having different preferences for how to use the parking lane. Well, back in the 1980s in Mountain View, they introduced a flex zone. You do what you want with it. If you want to turn that into your patio, go for it. If you want to keep the parking, fine. I also think we can do so much more if the chains are pulled off our options for action. I learned a bit from James Rojas in Oakland.
Give me an example of a chain. Give me the chain. You don't mean chain stores. What are the shackles that you want to have us pulled away from? What is that? Tell me one.
Okay, I'm going to give you an example of how we use street and sidewalk space. So James Rojas mentioned to me last week that in Oakland, when they turned 10% of the city streets into slow streets, suddenly people are doing what they want there, including commerce. He calls it Latino urbanism. If you've ever been in Latin America, you know that the sidewalks and other spaces are being used differently for micro commerce. Recently, when I was in Shanghai, I noticed that the Shanghainese are embracing this, but in a very sophisticated way, having, you know, beautiful, elegant micro commerce booths along streets. We need to remember that in order to attract more people to main streets or strips or these kinds of spaces, they need to serve more needs and they need to feel better. They need to be more attractive because we know there's a strong relationship between feelings of place attachment and GDP growth. Right.
I mean, there is something about the feel better piece, you know? Before I leave you, can you talk a little bit about other ways that you think we can actually physically make interventions on main streets that will attract people and they will feel better there?
I'll give you one example from our research here in Vancouver. Well, over the water in Vancouver. I'm in my mother's basement right now, but
I knew what you meant.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in Vancouver, introduced a program called Pavement to Plaza a couple of years ago, where they took car space, gave it back to people, and made very small plazas. We studied the effects of these plazas, and the effects were remarkable compared to the places that had not been changed. People felt more welcome there. Women felt safer there and more likely to return. So this is an equity issue as well. And people felt a deeper sense of belonging and commitment to the community. In other words, by making this small shift, people felt more bonded to the place, more likely to come back, and more likely to spend money, as well as more likely to connect with each other in ways that were supportive.
Right. Judith, in terms of the kind of typology of a main street, do you want to comment a little bit about how they've been changing over time? I mean, I think this is one of the dilemmas we've got with this. When I tell people we're doing Bring Back Main Streets, sometimes I get a cynical response, which was, oh, you know, main streets were in trouble before. You know, do you really think that there's a chance to revive them? But they've been changing, right? Main streets have been evolving.
Absolutely. We're seeing in my main street here, we have our premier shopping mall for the community. So that lines one whole side of our main street. Across the way, we have heritage buildings with ground floor retail. We also have new build, new office towers with also ground floor retail. So I think you see a whole mix of that. My colleague to the north of the tracks, they have old warehouses that have been converted into retail mixed use. So I think we're seeing all types, and using the term Main Street, I think, is just that traditional term we all revert to because we all have that hokey version of what Main Street was. But really, it's our commercial districts that tend to be more locally owned, that serve the local community. So the moniker is easy to use, and I think it invokes the same idea, but really it covers a wide range of of types of business improvement areas, business improvement districts, commercial areas throughout North America.
Do you have a thought on key kind of anchor entities on a main street, you know? So if we were talking about how they're going to revitalize or resurge, are there particular kinds of occupiers of main streets that you think are more the ones to focus on first, for instance?
Well, I think it depends on your business, I always use BID, but it depends on your neighborhood, because going back to what Michael was saying, there is usually a community affinity for one or two businesses that if that business goes down, so goes the rest of the community. So you really need to identify who that is, and it's going to be different for everyone. In some places, it's the restaurant. In some places, it's the retailer that's been there forever. So really, I hate saying this, but sometimes you really need to pick the guy that you can't let sink and throw everything you got at them and provide them all the support you can. Be on the phone with them at midnight if you have to, talking them through what you need to do, because if they go down, so goes, you know, the two or three businesses on either side of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really links to having a mindset about social purpose real estate. You know, so what is that? Is it a co-working space? Is it you know, inserting a not-for-profit organization on a main street and sharing? Charles and I were just talking about this before we got on the call, sharing space, you know, and fortunately there are financial institutions, to Michael's point, that are more grassroots, and we can sort out those shared revenue models and take a look at that to ensure that cash flow is more resilient. Because frankly, as much as we're talking about Main Street, with, you know, main streets run on cash flow, so the resiliency of cash flow is critical. And so if we know we've got a lever we can pull, to Judith's point, to ensure that survival mechanism kicks in on the main street or the communities, the commercial area that Mary's referring to, then we all of a sudden have a more resilient neighborhood that can financially support itself. So it's the mixed use that we need to take a look at and really be purposeful about how we use our real estate and the things that we're doing with it and who the tenants are in any given spot.
Yeah, this is a question about whether we need to formalize social purpose real estate. Do we need different kinds of rules to enable it? You know, one of the dilemmas that cities face is that they rely on the property tax as their to fuel their services. And does that then put it in a situation where municipal governments are less interested in making retail space on main streets affordable because they're burdened by the tax base? And they can't carry deficits, you know, which puts the municipalities in a spot that's right now in our current state next to impossible. Would you let them carry, you know, in BC, they're now being allowed to run a deficit. Would you let them do that? Would you have municipal governments? I would if it was specific to certain types of developments as it relates to land. Absolutely. I wouldn't let them, you know, go out and, you know, create giant credit lines to cash flow their operations. But if they're on a project by project basis, you know, and you want to start, you know, Charles has mentioned equity a couple times, the value of that land and that 99-year lease on that land, you know, we can work that better at a municipal level as it relates to, you know, raise a bond, then have an affordable, like Mary, I could talk about it for hours, really. Michael could too. I've been watching. Next webinar. Michael, you've mentioned some macro interventions and then some really micro ones, you know, because you adopting the poets, bus stop poet, I can't remember the name of it.
Busboys and Poets, yeah.
Busboys, I knew it was Busboys. You adopting that is your personal commitment. I've seen some discourse from people suggesting that consumers be challenged to allocate a percentage of their disposable income as they emerge to spend in their local community. Do you think that's always good for the economy, but I think now people really see the value in nudging themselves a little bit more along those lines. And you're almost suggesting a community supported agriculture kind of model for a restaurant, so that you actually make those share purchases ahead of time, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can't necessarily make it completely formal. We can't say to a restaurant, convert into completely a community supported model, but I think we can have them do it for 100 people, and it would make a big difference in their cash flow. And I will call out that there's a Canadian company in Winnipeg, which has a program called Local Future, which is a platform to help communities do this kind of pre-purchasing en masse. And I think it's a very good thing to look at.
I was going to actually ask you folks about the digital piece, because, you know, this old story that technology is our friend and maybe not always our friend. Lots and lots of entities like the one that was highlighted in Winnipeg, and then there's Distantly and a few others that are sparking up, where I can actually make an investment through a digital platform into a local business that gets me product in return. And also, of course, lots and lots of businesses have suddenly got with the program and gone digital. Do you see the digital piece as ultimately threatening Main Street? I mean, Amazon has been here for a while. Or do you think it can be integrated into it in a positive way? Judith, you want to start? What do you think?
I think seeing what happened now and knowing the businesses that we have here in Regina struggle with the sudden collapse in patrons, they have to go digital, especially if we hit a second or third wave and this happens again. Now is the time to start getting them accustomed to doing commerce online. And that's where some of the bids, especially in Ontario, I know the Digital Main Street platform, it's probably going to be oversubscribed now, given the importance that those mom and pop shops that probably were staying away from online because it was new and scary to them, and maybe they felt that their product line didn't lend itself to that. Now they have to go to it. So I think that's where bids and BIAs need to pivot in terms of being either that connector between the business and providers like Digital Main Street, or be the educators themselves and become experts.
As you say, can they coexist? I think that's the question. We tend to be all or nothing. Oh, no, I never do digital, or I do that. If there's a way to take this technology in a way that enhances my communication with somebody, could be a business, it could be a block away, right? Could be.
I think they can definitely coexist. You're always going to want folks that want that personal service. And I think, especially if bids and BIs and businesses do a good job of personalizing, putting the face to the name. You know, this is Comic Readers Downtown, and this is the gentleman that owns it. This is his livelihood. This is what he does every day. I think once folks have that personal connection to the guy that owns it, whether they're online or face-to-face, they will still support that gentleman because they know Chad from Comic Readers.
You know, we're again at Bring Back Main Street, the project that we're initiating at COI with a whole bunch of partners across the country, including Charles and including VanCity, and including IDA, including Judith, all of you, except you, Michael. We're going to rope you in too. But part of what we're wondering about is how do you support some evolutionary change that was in the works of happening anyway? So I have a barber shop down here. I live on a main street. And to the left of me is a barbershop. He's had that business for 45 years. He doesn't want to cut hair anymore, but he does not have an easy way to get that business, to get the value out of the business and find someone to do it. And I know that in smaller communities, it's even tougher. There is maybe no buyer for these services. And how do we sort of support the natural succession that happens? Are there measures that public policy could, or the financing community, or the design community, Charles, are there ways to ease those transitions? Anybody done any thinking on that?
Well, I can add something, which is a group of collaborators and I did a handbook on community investment funds, primarily in the United States. And one of the things that we're noticing is that some of these sort of new generation of community investment funds are focused on succession issues. So they basically are acquiring businesses like the one you mentioned, where the gentleman wants to retire, and in a way reinventing those businesses, opening them up for community investment, and ultimately spinning those businesses back out again. I think municipalities working in conjunction with local banks and credit unions could do a terrific job in really replicating these kinds of funds across Canada.
Yeah, a number of you have mentioned community foundations, community asset funds, this idea of a community finance fund that's being experimented with in Newfoundland through the FOGO Shorefast folks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm noticing we have participants from Letterkenny, Ireland, and Riga, Latvia. These are you have old traditional main streets in those parts of Europe, and we know that pubs, for instance, started to have difficulty surviving, and then communities have come in self-organized to sort of do more even than adopting, Michael. I think they actually take out shares and it becomes a community-owned business. Do we need more models like that? Charles, you're in the part of the country that has more of a reputation for that kind of ownership model. Do you want to comment at all about what you're seeing?
Well, I think you've just made the point, so I might not take it further. It's happening. Community land trusts are doing it, and it's happening at the grassroots. So I want to note something I read from Chris at Resonance, who's noted that now small local businesses are considered an amenity of much new high density residential, but the problem is they're bearing this terrible tax burden. Yeah. And so Chris suggested two things. First of all, actually, no, this is a suggestion from me and many of your commenters in the chat. We need to shift the tax burden away from local small businesses. It's killing them. It has been for years. And that's a tough one. It requires political bravery. But on the second piece, Chris noted that if it's an amenity, why doesn't the building strata own that amenity and run it like an amenity? If you want a coffee shop, have your own coffee shop. I mean, this is sort of a mega response because you require a large building with lots going on in the strata. But I also want to note one more thing is that, we are still businesses are quite hamstrung with parking requirements, for example. And we have these main streets now that have and will increasingly have broken teeth. And we need to fill in those gaps. And we can do that with local governments and entities supporting pop-up commercial spaces to seed the next generation of entrepreneurs in between them so they don't fall together.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things we have to, and this is where I think some of those competing desires are going to, come to blows, is we have to accept that the taxation model that currently exists is generally the source of revenue for our municipalities. It's either tax or parking. And so, to your point, they're so hamstrung, Charles. So it's almost like, do you remember the whole P3 model, Charles, in BC when they were thinking about building the new Portman Bridge, and then everybody came to the table and said, let's all do it, and then it blew up? Like, there's a level of territorialism, and Judith, I'm sure you'll relate to this, is when you own and start a business, there's pride. I'm doing this on my own. I'm going to make it on my own. This is my business. This is my cash flow. So we have this thing where, coming together and sharing revenue or models or, the co-op mentality in business, isn't quite there yet. And I think that this crisis potentially is creating a little bit more urgency about some of the things that Charles is talking about. So how does policy come together with, organizations on a main street, whatever the definition of that is, to actually have those meaningful conversations and say to a municipality, we get it. All you get money from is parking and tax. So like, how can we all work together to ensure that we mobilize those things in a way that works? And community investment, as a community investment right in our name, I understand the importance of that as it relates to how do we encourage those transitions and conversations and have stakeholders at the table that may not be speaking the same language. Because Mary, you've seen it so many times in Toronto. We sit down at a table and everyone's speaking different language. You got a guy like Charles talking about happy cities, you know, and people that are in the municipal bureaucracies going, who is this guy? Like, what's he even saying? Like, I don't even, and so I think there's something about nomenclature and language. We have to come together and say, like, what are we all really talking about here, so that we all are at the same spot. Michael, what do you think of that? Do you think that that plays a role in miscommunication potentially and mobilization?
Oh, absolutely. We represent thousands of tribes, and this is our calling to come together and start speaking together. And I also think it's true internationally, and I like the way that everyone here has mentioned international examples, because we have so much to learn abroad. I mean, I cite, believe it or not, Canadian examples when I'm trying to convince American cities to do more local investment. Michigan, in their tax credit for local investment, can thank New Brunswick for the idea.
Good, good. That's good. We'd like to see the learning going both ways, Michael. We're kind of rounding the corner on this, and I appreciate that we've tried to balance conversations about space and place and investment and public policy and money. As you look to the future, and as I fear we are dealing with most cynical kind of media that think that this is the end of Main Street. And whenever someone says that, you know, part of me wants to say, oh, don't you be counting it out so fast. Do you each have a minute you want to speak to about what the priorities need to be going forward? If our listeners had 3 things that they would focus on to bring back their Main Street, what would it be? Judith?
Come up with that idea. Come up with the ideas, throw them at the wall, try them. Time is of essence. You know, that whole quote, speed, not perfection. Let's do it now, because if you wait too long, if you study it to death, we'll have missed the boat. It's going to be too late.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you that we're going to find smart things that local communities will do. You've all been citing examples of them. And how do we then spread that so that somebody hears, hey, they've been trying this in Abbotsford, hey, we're going to try it too. So find the idea, see if you can make it, see if you can attach it to your
absolutely
work. Mm-hmm.
And obviously, you know, keep health and safety first and foremost, but be unafraid to experiment. Now is the time. People are willing to forgive things that don't work. So let's take advantage of that groundswell, because if we wait too long, you'll be criticized for waiting too long. And then all eyes will be on you if things don't work out. So yeah, just take advantage of the sentiment that's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is just nimbleness. I often talk about how you can try stuff in smaller communities before a big city will try, because the smaller community is more nimble. It will try something that a big city can then copy. Same may be true for businesses. If you have staff of 10, 12, 30 people, you can try some stuff much more easily than a company that's got thousands of employees. Michael, what do you think? 2 or 3 things you would have people focus on?
Yeah, figure out in your community the businesses or the projects or the Main Street pieces that are most worth bringing to life. Figure out how to convert it into a locally investable product, and then systematically start moving your long-term savings into Main Street where it belongs. And the most important thing is that compared to losing 20% in the market, which is where most people are right now, I think it is a bargain.
There you go. So the risk is a more modest one locally too. That's the other point you'd say, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, Jake.
I would say look at what you do, what your business does, and where you dovetail into the business community. So who can you partner with? And we talk about capital stack in banking, but I look at business stacks. So who can you partner with on your Main Street to amplify what you do? So for example, I'll give you a practical example. In Stratford, Ontario, there is like a phenomenally amazing ice cream shop who is a storefront. So people walk in. down the street there is a tea maker. And so these two businesses have both gone to curbside and controlled, you know, environments with their local community, and they've been co-creating products together. So like a tea latte with a scoop of, you know, custard in it, and you know, then the cupcake girl got involved. And I think that that's the thing, you know, the more voices you can partner with, and the more you take your blinders of fear off, because, you know, I'm not going to discredit the blinders of fear, but if you're only focused on what's going on for you, you're missing the opportunities out here. So go to your peer group in your local BIA and your local business community and say, hey, I do this. What do you do? Can we combine, you know, your piece of pottery with my ice cream, and we'll deliver it, or people can come and pick it up.
This is the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup approach to economic innovation. Chocolate met peanut butter, and then you, by accident, and then you got, only some people know what I'm talking about, but there you go. Thanks, Jake. Charles, what is your sort of watchword? What would you encourage people to pursue?
Number one, I'm going to take Michael's advice. I love your piece about committing $1,000 to a local business that you support over the long run. I'm going to do it. Thank you, Michael. I think we need to remember that everybody's budgets are tight, but guess what? Tactical responses on local streets and main streets, they're almost free. We just need some traffic cones and some paint, and we can do it. And we're experimenting now. Let's do more. Let's do it quickly. Second of all, I think we need to acknowledge that recovery is not replication of what was. We're heading towards something new. Let's be open to experimentation. So I'm saying let more happen on land. Maybe your next favorite business emerges in your neighbor's garage, for example. So let's be more flexible. Let's be more open. Take the chains off.
The shackles are being released as we speak. We're going to go. Charles's basement has been liberated, and together we are bringing back Main Street, everybody. So thank you for joining us. If you could send us photographs, please, to #BringBackMainStreet and tag us at CanUrb, or email it to covidresponse@canurb.org. We really want to see what's going on. And again, the chat once again today was a knockout with a gazillion people putting great ideas and reports and options and ideas. And the conversation never ends as we talk about cities and how they're evolving in a time of COVID. So thank you. Thanks, folks, for joining us very much. We're really happy to have you. The conversation on this one is going to go on for a long time.
Thanks, Mary.
So we're very appreciative. Thanks,
Appreciate
everybody.
it. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Back for
Bye
City
now.
Talk on Thursday at noon Eastern. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.